A man is lying on the floor of a concrete room. There is a hole in his skull. He put it there himself. His name is Jack Powers. Before he entered the federal prison system, there was no documented history of mental illness. None. He was a functioning adult. He ran a construction company. He committed armed robbery. He went to prison. And then they moved him here. According to federal court records and reporting by the New York Times, what followed was 12 years of systematic psychological disintegration. Powers began mutilating himself. He bit off his own fingers. He severed his earlobes. He sliced open his scrotum with a piece of plastic. And then, in what court documents describe with clinical detachment, he used a sharpened object to drill into his own skull. The Bureau of Prisons knew he was deteriorating. They had him on a psychiatric watch list. They transferred him for stabilization. And when doctors declared him stable enough to return, they sent him straight back to the same concrete box. He was classified as mentally ill. He was returned to solitary anyway. Every psychiatrist who has studied this facility agrees on one thing. Prolonged isolation does not simply make people sad. It does not simply make them angry. According to research published in psychiatric literature and testimony submitted to the United States Senate, isolation structurally alters how the human brain processes reality. It produces hallucinations in people who never had them. It generates paranoia so severe that some inmates cannot accurately tell whether something happened yesterday or 10 years ago. Jack Powers is not an outlier. He is a documented pattern. ADX Florence. The Alcatraz of the Rockies. The end of the line. Built in 1994. Designed specifically to be the harshest, most isolated federal prison in American history. Housing at its peak over 400 men. Some of the most dangerous people the United States government has ever incarcerated. And some who ended up here by bureaucratic transfer, prison politics, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong moment inside another facility. 23 hours a day alone in a 7 by 12 foot concrete cell. 1 hour of recreation in a cage the size of a parking space. Meals delivered through a slot in the door. Human contact, reduced to the brief exchange of a tray and a closing door. 4 years. 4 decades. For some men. For the rest of their lives. This is the story of what that does to a human being. Not according to activists alone. Not according to lawyers alone. According to brain scans. According to court records. According to the men who survived it, the men who didn't, and the psychiatrists who walked those corridors and came out disturbed by what they witnessed. The question this video is going to answer is not whether ADX Florence is tough. Everyone agrees it is tough. The question is this: at what point does a punishment stop punishing a person and start destroying them? If you have ever wondered what the absolute limit of human punishment looks like inside the American justice system, you are in the right place. This channel covers the stories that most people never hear. If that is the kind of content you want more of, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. And if you make it to the end of this video, there is something waiting for you that will completely reframe everything you just watched. Let us get into it. Most people have heard the name. Very few people understand what it actually means to be inside it. ADX Florence is not a regular maximum security prison. It is not even a regular Supermax. It is something the Bureau of Prisons deliberately engineered to be a level beyond anything that existed before it. A facility where the architecture itself is the punishment. To understand why it was built, you have to go back to the early 1980s. The federal prison system was facing a crisis it could not contain. Violence inside high-security facilities had reached a point where staff were being killed and administrators had run out of options. 2 murders in particular forced the government's hand. In 1983, at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, 2 correctional officers were killed on the same day in separate attacks. Their names were Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman. Both were killed by inmates who were already serving life sentences and had nothing left to lose. There was no additional punishment the system could threaten them with. Marion responded by placing the entire institution on permanent lockdown, becoming the first federal prison to operate under what officials called a control unit model, where inmates were confined to their cells for most of the day. Marion became the blueprint. But it was not enough. Through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the federal system continued to accumulate inmates that no existing facility could safely manage. Gang leaders who continued running criminal organizations from inside prison. Cartel figures who intimidated staff and other prisoners. Individuals who had demonstrated repeatedly that they were willing to kill regardless of consequence. The Bureau of Prisons needed somewhere to put people that was truly beyond reach. A facility so controlled, so isolated, so total in its containment that the concept of influence from inside became impossible. Construction began in southern Colorado on 37 acres of high desert land. The facility opened in 1994 and was given the designation ADX, which stands for Administrative Maximum. It cost approximately $60 million to build and was designed from the ground up around a single governing principle: eliminate every possible avenue of human communication, voluntary movement, and external influence. What that looks like in practice is this. Each inmate lives in a cell that measures approximately 7 feet by 12 feet. The cell contains a pod concrete sleeping slab, a concrete desk, a concrete stool, a combination toilet and sink unit made from brushed steel, with no edges that could be sharpened. A shower that runs on a timer activated from outside the cell. A black and white television mounted behind a thick window in the wall, through which inmates can access limited educational programming. The entire cell, including the furniture, is made from concrete. This is intentional. Concrete cannot be broken down into weapons the way metal furniture can. The cell door is solid steel. It has no handle on the inside. It opens when a guard activates a mechanism from the corridor. At the base of the door is a food slot, approximately the width and height of a standard envelope. That slot is how meals arrive. That slot is, on most days, the primary point of physical interaction between an inmate and another human being. There is one window. It is a slit, approximately 6 inches wide, cut through the thick concrete exterior wall. It is angled in such a way that an inmate can see a small patch of sky and nothing else. No other building. No other person. No visual reference point to the outside world except a rectangle of light that changes color as the day passes. For 23 hours out of every 24, that cell is the entire world. The 1 hour outside takes place in what the Bureau of Prisons calls a recreation enclosure. It is a concrete-walled cage approximately the size of a small parking space, open to the sky through a mesh ceiling. There is nothing in it. No equipment. No seating. Just concrete and sky. Inmates exercise alone. They do not interact with other inmates in the general population, because there is no general population. Everyone at ADX is in the same condition of isolation. The recreation enclosures are arranged so that inmates in adjacent cages cannot see each other. Communication between inmates is technically prohibited but not entirely preventable. According to court documents and investigative reporting, inmates over the years developed ways of communicating through plumbing pipes, shouting through vents, and passing notes through intermediary channels during medical or legal appointments. The facility has continuously responded to each discovered method by tightening restrictions further. Visits from family are permitted but extremely limited and conducted through thick glass with telephone communication. Physical contact is not permitted. According to court records and accounts gathered by human rights organizations, many inmates go years without any physical human contact whatsoever. Not a handshake. Not a hand on the shoulder. Nothing. There are currently 5 general housing units inside ADX Florence, plus a special housing unit for inmates deemed the highest risk even within the context of the facility itself. The step-down program, which theoretically allows inmates to gradually transfer to a lower security facility over a period of years, has been documented by lawyers and advocates as extremely difficult to navigate, with many inmates spending far longer at ADX than their original placement decisions suggested. At various points in its history, ADX Florence has housed some of the most notorious figures in American criminal history. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, spent years there. Zacharias Musesa, convicted in connection with the September 11th attacks, was housed there. Ramzi Youssef, the architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, has been held there. Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was sent there. Joaquin Guzman Lora, known as El Chapo, was transferred there following his 2019 conviction. The facility also holds former FBI agent Robert Hansen, who was convicted of spying for the Soviet Union and Russia over a period of more than 2 decades. But alongside these high-profile cases, ADX Florence has also housed inmates who arrived not because of a single catastrophic crime, but because of behavior within the federal prison system itself. Individuals who assaulted staff at other facilities. Individuals who were identified as gang leaders exerting influence. Individuals caught with contraband. The facility is not exclusively populated by the most famous criminals in America. It is populated by whoever the Bureau of Prisons determines requires this level of control. And that distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Because the question of what ADX Florence was designed to do and what it actually does to the people inside it, those are 2 very different questions. The architects of this facility believed they were building a management tool, a way to neutralize the most dangerous people in the system and remove their capacity to harm others. What they may not have fully anticipated, or what they anticipated and accepted, is that the same conditions engineered to contain dangerous behavior are, according to decades of psychiatric research, also conditions that systematically produce mental illness in people who did not have it before, that actively worsen mental illness in people who arrived with pre-existing conditions, and that in documented cases have pushed human beings past the point of psychological return. The machine works exactly as designed. The question that has haunted lawyers, psychiatrists, journalists, and federal judges for 30 years is whether a machine that works exactly as designed can still be causing catastrophic, unconstitutional harm. That question does not have a simple answer, but the evidence that surrounds it is overwhelming, and we are only just getting started. Before we go any further, a question. Imagine you are placed in a room. The room is quiet. There is nothing to do. No one to talk to. You sit there for an hour. Maybe 2. By hour 3 you are restless. By hour 6 you are uncomfortable in a way that is difficult to describe. Not physical pain. Something else. A pressure behind the eyes. An itching in the mind. Now imagine that does not end. Not after a day. Not after a week. Not after a month. Imagine that condition. That silence. That stillness. That complete absence of human contact, stretching forward into years, into decades, with no confirmed end date, with no way to know whether it will ever stop. That is not a hypothetical. That is the daily reality documented inside ADX Florence. And what it does to the human brain is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of neuroscience. In the early 1990s, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist named Stuart Grassian began conducting interviews with inmates held in solitary confinement units across the United States. What he documented was so consistent across different individuals, different facilities, and different backgrounds that he published his findings in a landmark paper that would later be cited in federal court cases, Senate testimony, and United Nations reports on torture. Grassian identified a specific psychiatric syndrome that he argued was produced directly by solitary confinement conditions. The symptoms included hypersensitivity to external stimuli, where ordinary sounds like a door closing or a guard's footsteps became overwhelming and painful. Perceptual distortions, where inmates began seeing things move in their peripheral vision that were not there. Paranoia, aggressive fantasies, difficulty with thinking and concentration so severe that inmates who had been functioning, literate adults began struggling to follow a basic conversation or read a paragraph from beginning to end. And in the most severe cases, frank hallucinations, visual and auditory, in people with no prior history of psychosis. What made Grassian's work particularly significant was not just what he found but how consistent it was. These were not isolated incidents of disturbed individuals reacting badly to confinement. These were predictable, reproducible responses occurring across a wide population of people exposed to the same conditions. The condition behaved like a syndrome because it was one. Later research built directly on Grassian's foundation. Psychiatrist Terry Kupers, who also testified in multiple federal cases involving solitary confinement, documented what he described as the particular cruelty of housing people with pre-existing mental illness in isolation conditions. His testimony and published work described how solitary confinement does not simply fail to treat mental illness. It actively accelerates it. It takes conditions that were manageable in a general population setting and drives them toward crisis, toward psychosis, toward self-harm, toward suicide. This is where the case of Thomas Silverstein becomes impossible to ignore. Thomas Silverstein was convicted of murder and entered the federal prison system in the late 1970s. Inside prison, he killed again, including the murder of a correctional officer at USP Marion in 1983, one of the killings that preceded the Marion lockdown described in the previous chapter. He was unquestionably a violent man who had committed serious crimes inside the system. But what happened to him after those crimes is documented in extraordinary detail because Silverstein himself became a litigant, filing lawsuits that eventually produced sworn affidavits, court testimony, and judicial findings that paint a precise picture of what 36 years in near-total isolation does to a human being. Silverstein spent roughly 3 decades under a special designation called no human contact status. According to court documents and his own sworn testimony, there were extended periods where he went years without a single conversation with another person. Guards were under instruction not to speak to him beyond functional necessity. When he was moved, which happened dozens of times across different facilities including extended periods at ADX Florence, he was moved through empty corridors, with other inmates locked away so that he could not interact with anyone. In his own words, documented in legal filings, he described the experience of isolation producing a state where time became meaningless, where he could not always distinguish between what had happened recently and what had happened years before, where he developed an obsessive relationship with artwork. He was permitted limited art materials at certain points, as the only activity through which he could maintain any sense of continuity with himself. Federal courts that reviewed his case made findings that are worth sitting with. A court examining his conditions noted that the level of isolation imposed on Silverstein was unprecedented and that its psychological effects were severe and documentable. While courts ultimately did not find his specific conditions unconstitutional given the severity of his crimes, the documented psychological deterioration was not disputed. He died in federal custody in 2019 at the age of 67, having spent more than 3 decades in isolation conditions. He had been in solitary longer than many of the correctional officers currently working at ADX Florence have been alive. His case is extreme, but the psychological mechanism it illustrates is not. Because what the research shows, and what case after case at ADX Florence confirms, is that the human brain is not built for this. The brain is a social organ. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a biological one. Human neurological development from infancy onward is structured around social interaction, the processing of facial expressions, the reading of tone and intention, the neurochemical rewards produced by connection and reciprocal communication. These are not optional features of human cognition. They are central to how the brain maintains its own stability. When those inputs are removed, not reduced, but systematically eliminated, the brain does not simply idle. It does not patiently wait for conditions to improve. It begins producing its own stimulation. It manufactures experiences to fill the void. and what it manufactures, in the documented literature on sensory deprivation and isolation, is increasingly indistinguishable from the symptoms of psychosis. Psychiatrist Atul Gawande, writing in The New Yorker in a widely cited 2009 piece on solitary confinement, summarized the scientific consensus in terms that have been referenced in federal proceedings. Drawing on decades of research including studies of prisoners of war and hostages, he concluded that prolonged solitary confinement causes the kind of psychiatric symptoms that would be classified as torture under international human rights standards. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture reached a similar conclusion. In 2011, Juan Mendez presented a report to the UN General Assembly arguing that solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, and that indefinite or prolonged solitary confinement constitutes torture outright, under international law. The United States has not adopted that position officially, and ADX Florence continues to operate. But the medical and scientific consensus has continued to harden. Neuroimaging studies of people who have experienced prolonged isolation show measurable changes in brain structure and function. Research on the effects of extreme social deprivation in early childhood, studied extensively in the cases of children raised in severely deprived institutional conditions, shows that isolation literally alters the physical architecture of the developing brain. Adult brains are more resilient but not immune. The same pathways that require social input to function properly begin to degrade when that input is permanently withdrawn. Now bring that back to a 7 by 12 foot concrete cell in Florence, Colorado. A man wakes up. The light in his cell does not change significantly between day and night because it is controlled externally. His meal arrives through a slot. He does not hear his own name spoken in a normal conversational tone. He exercises alone in a concrete box. He returns to his cell. He lies on a concrete slab. He watches a black and white television through thick glass. He goes to sleep. He wakes up. The same. Every day. For years. And the documented outcomes, the hallucinations, the self-mutilation, the complete psychological collapse in cases like Jack Powers, are not aberrations. They are the statistically predictable result of placing human beings in conditions that the human nervous system cannot sustain. This is the part that the architects of ADX Florence, by all available evidence, understood when they built it. The purpose was total incapacitation, total removal from the human environment, total neutralization of the capacity to cause harm. What the medical literature argues, and what the lawsuits have argued, is that you cannot engineer a condition specifically designed to remove every element that sustains human psychological functioning, and then be surprised when human psychological functioning collapses. There is a word for causing severe suffering intentionally, systematically, and with full knowledge of the effects. Federal courts have so far declined to apply that word to ADX Florence. The psychiatrists who have walked its corridors largely have not. And the inmates who lived it, the ones who came out the other side, describe something that no clinical language quite captures. Not just suffering. Not just damage. The feeling, as one former inmate described in documented testimony, that you reached inside yourself one day looking for the person you used to be and found that he was simply gone. By the mid-2000s, the evidence had accumulated to a point that was difficult to ignore. Lawyers had it. Psychiatrists had it. Journalists had it. Federal judges were beginning to grapple with it in courtrooms across the country. The documented psychological destruction produced by prolonged solitary confinement at facilities like ADX Florence was no longer a fringe argument made by prison abolitionists on the margins of public debate. It was a body of evidence, peer-reviewed, court-tested, entered into the congressional record. And still the facility operated. Still the doors closed. Still the food slots opened and shut. Still the men sat in their concrete boxes and the days became weeks and the weeks became years. So the lawyers went to court. In 2012, a coalition of current and former ADX Florence inmates filed a federal class action lawsuit that would become one of the most significant legal challenges to solitary confinement conditions in American history. The case, known as Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, was filed in the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. The plaintiffs argued that the Bureau of Prisons was systematically housing inmates with serious mental illness in conditions that violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They argued that the step-down program that was supposed to provide a pathway out of ADX was effectively broken, trapping inmates indefinitely regardless of their behavior or mental health status. And they argued that the Bureau of Prisons had actual knowledge of the psychological harm being caused and was continuing to cause it anyway. The legal filings that emerged from that case are extraordinarily detailed. Sworn declarations from psychiatrists who had personally evaluated ADX inmates describe individual after individual experiencing the same constellation of symptoms that Stuart Grassian had documented decades earlier. Hallucinations, self-mutilation, complete psychological disintegration. Men who had arrived at ADX as difficult, dangerous, but psychologically intact human beings and who were, years later, described in clinical language as exhibiting symptoms consistent with severe psychiatric disorder directly attributable to their conditions of confinement. One declaration filed in the case described an inmate who had been at ADX for years and who spent his days pacing his cell in a fixed pattern, unable to stop, unable to explain why, the repetitive movement having become the only way his nervous system could process the unending sameness of his environment. Another described an inmate who had begun hoarding the styrofoam cups his meals arrived in, stacking them in elaborate configurations around his cell, a behavior that staff initially treated as a disciplinary issue, before a psychiatric evaluation suggested it was a response to the total absence of any environmental complexity or change. These are not dramatic cases. That is precisely the point. They are ordinary cases. Ordinary responses to extraordinary conditions. The kind of thing that happens not because the individuals involved are uniquely fragile, but because the human nervous system has limits, and ADX Florence is specifically designed to press against every one of them simultaneously. The Bureau of Prisons did not concede the core arguments of the lawsuit. But in 2014 they reached a settlement agreement that was widely covered in the legal and criminal justice press. Under the terms of the settlement, the Bureau of Prisons agreed to a series of reforms. They agreed to develop a new program for identifying and treating seriously mentally ill inmates at ADX. They agreed to improvements in the step-down program. They agreed to enhanced mental health screening and monitoring. They agreed to the involvement of an independent monitor to assess compliance. Civil rights lawyers and advocates who had fought for the settlement were careful in how they described it. It was progress. It was the first time the Bureau of Prisons had formally agreed to any significant reform of ADX conditions under legal pressure. But it was also explicitly not an admission of wrongdoing. And the core conditions of the facility, the 23-hour lockdown, the isolation, the concrete cells, the food slots, the total absence of meaningful human contact, those remained in place. Because the settlement addressed the treatment of the mentally ill within the system. It did not address the system itself. And that distinction is the fault line at the center of every debate about ADX Florence that has happened since. The argument made by the Bureau of Prisons and by successive administrations that have overseen it is essentially this. ADX Florence houses people who have demonstrated, repeatedly and lethally, that they cannot be safely managed in any other environment. The facility exists not as punishment in the philosophical sense, but as a management necessity. The people inside it are there because every alternative was tried and failed. And the security outcomes, the absence of staff murders, the neutralization of criminal networks, the containment of individuals who would otherwise pose catastrophic risks, those outcomes are real and they matter. This argument is not dishonest. It is not without foundation. The documented history of violence at Marion before the lockdown and at other high-security facilities where the most dangerous inmates were managed in general population settings is real. The harm caused by allowing gang leaders to operate freely inside prison, to other inmates, to staff, to people on the outside, is real. The problem of individuals who have killed correctional officers and who, absent extreme containment, would likely kill again is a real problem that requires a real answer. The counterargument, made by psychiatrists, by human rights organizations including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, by the American Civil Liberties Union, and increasingly by former correctional officials who have worked inside facilities like ADX, is this. The conditions at ADX Florence go far beyond what is necessary to achieve those legitimate security goals. The duration of isolation, years, decades, lifetime, is not a security requirement. It is a choice. The elimination of every form of meaningful human contact is not a security requirement. It is a choice. The housing of seriously mentally ill individuals in conditions that are clinically documented to worsen mental illness is not a security requirement. It is a choice. And choices have moral weight. Former Colorado Senator Mark Udall spent years pushing for reforms to federal solitary confinement practices and spoke publicly about ADX Florence on multiple occasions. He described the facility as a stain on the American justice system and argued that the conditions inside it were inconsistent with basic human dignity regardless of the crimes of the people held there. President Obama's administration, in its final years, commissioned a review of solitary confinement practices across the federal prison system. The report, released in 2016, acknowledged that solitary confinement was overused in the federal system and recommended significant reductions in its application. It specifically noted the documented psychological harm caused by prolonged isolation and called for limits on the use of solitary for juveniles, pregnant women, and people with serious mental illness. The report was a significant moment, a sitting administration formally acknowledging through an official review what advocates had been arguing for decades. But acknowledgement is not the same as action. The core infrastructure of ADX Florence was not dismantled. The facility continued to operate. And when administrations changed, the momentum behind reform shifted. The story of Jack Powers, the man we met at the beginning of this video, did not end with his psychological collapse. It ended in federal court. Powers sued the Bureau of Prisons, arguing that they had housed him in conditions that caused his mental deterioration with full knowledge of what those conditions were doing to him and without adequate psychiatric intervention. His case became part of the broader legal record documenting what ADX Florence produces. He was not the only one. Court records from various proceedings involving ADX Florence describe a consistent pattern. Inmates arrive. The isolation begins. Psychiatric symptoms emerge or worsen. Mental health staff note the deterioration. Sometimes inmates are transferred temporarily for psychiatric stabilization. Then they are returned. The cycle continues. The documentation accumulates. And the facility continues. There is a detail in the architecture of ADX Florence that has been noted by multiple journalists and commentators who have visited or studied the facility. The design of the cells, the angles of the slit windows, the arrangement of the corridors, all of it was engineered specifically to minimize the possibility that an inmate might ever see another human being. From inside his cell, a man at ADX Florence can look through his slit window and see sky. Only sky. The window is angled so that no other building, no perimeter fence, no guard, no other human being is visible. Just sky. This was a deliberate design decision. It was intended to prevent communication, to prevent the kind of visual contact through which inmates at other facilities had coordinated, signaled, and organized. But there is something in that detail that goes beyond security engineering. The complete erasure of the human from the visual field. The engineering of an environment in which another person is never, in any circumstance, within the frame of what you can perceive. Neuroscientists who study social cognition describe the recognition of other human faces and bodies as one of the most fundamental inputs the human brain processes. We are wired, at a deep neurological level, to seek and respond to other human beings. It is not a preference. It is architecture. The parts of the brain devoted to social perception, to reading faces and understanding intention and anticipating the behavior of others, are among the most active and metabolically demanding structures we have. They require input to function, and they do not idle gracefully when that input is removed. What ADX Florence engine is, among other things, is the systematic starvation of those systems. For years, for decades, and yet the facility stands. The doors close. The food slots open. The sky is visible through the slit window, and the question that has followed this place since the day it opened remains unanswered by any court, any administration, or any piece of legislation. At what point does the state's legitimate interest in containing dangerous people cross the line into something the state should not be doing to human beings regardless of what those human beings have done? That line has never been clearly drawn. Not in Florence, Colorado. Not in Washington. Not in any courtroom that has examined this place and then permitted it to continue. The facility was built on a certainty. The certainty that some people are so dangerous, so irredeemable, so threatening to the fabric of any community, including a prison community, that the only answer is permanent removal from human contact. What 30 years of documented evidence has produced is not a refutation of that certainty exactly. It is something more uncomfortable. It is the suggestion that the certainty may be correct about some people and simultaneously that acting on it, in the specific way ADX Florence acts on it, produces outcomes that are indistinguishable from what we would call, in any other context, the deliberate destruction of a human mind. Both of those things can be true at the same time. That is not a comfortable place to end, but it is an honest one. And the men in those concrete cells in Florence, Colorado, the ones still there tonight, the ones who were there last night, and the ones who will be there tomorrow night and the night after that, they are not waiting for the debate to resolve itself. They are just waiting. In the silence. In the concrete. In the pale light coming through a slit in the wall that shows them nothing but sky. And if you want to understand why that matters, not just for them, not just for the American justice system, but for what it means about the kind of society that builds a place like this and calls it justice, then stay right here. Because the next video goes somewhere even darker. It goes inside the minds of the men who designed places like ADX Florence, the psychologists who consulted on their construction, and the moment one of them looked at what he had helped create and publicly said he wished he never had. That story is up next, and you are not going to want to miss it.